applicable. The next slide, we just talk about the use of a foreign trust in wealth planning. So what effectively it does, it is ensure the continuation of the plan without having to transfer the assets to heirs or legatees. And because the trust never passed away, as opposed to the individual, you avoid the situation of having going through probate, i.e., that is having your estate assessed by the relevant authorities to determine your death duties, liabilities. Also with the estate, with a trust, everything is wrapped up in the trust. So there's no requirement for a foreign will because the trust continues to hold those assets, and the trustees have power to deal with those assets, and the trustees in turn are given guidance by way of a letter of wishes. And obviously, because you do not have a foreign will, you don't have foreign executor or executors. Obviously, the foreign trust exists outside South Africa, so it's not subject to South African tax legislation, assuming it's not managed or controlled in South Africa. And it also offers protection from creditors, from political risks in jurisdictions, for instance, South Africa. We don't have to discuss the political risks in South Africa. And it also gives protection against foreign currency in that South Africa has got exchange control, and they are driven by regulations and are capable of amendment at any point in time by the government, by the Minister of Finance, not by Parliament, and those can change at any time by way of an amendment in the regulation. Whereas the foreign trust determines or established in Mauritius, where there are no exchange controls, determines the functional currency, maybe dollars, and dollars can flow in and flow out freely. So there is the added asset protection of the functional currency being held in dollars without a possible compulsory conversion into a domestic currency. And then your other advantage of the trust is that any gains made by the trust don't trigger any South African tax liability. So you have got the ability to roll up the growth in the trust accumulated without loss caused by way of taxation. We obviously only talk about the anti-avoidance provisions in South Africa that try to overcome the situation and tax the foreign trust where certain circumstances are present. Now, what we have, I'm going back to the trust, a trust from the South African point of view is regarded as a conduit, and that means that the income of the trust retains its nature, or the accruals of the trust retains its nature when distributed to a beneficiary. So if the trust receives a return from a collective investment scheme and ultimately distributes that return to a South African beneficiary, it's regarded as a return from a collective investment scheme, and there's no exemption flowing from or accruing in respect of that distribution. So that return on the collective investment scheme, when declared to the beneficiaries, will be taxed at the beneficiary's marginal tax rate of in South Africa. Where investments are held directly and a dividend is returned, where the investment is less than 10%, as I mentioned, the maximum tax rate applicable to that in South Africa will be 20%. Where the investment is returned is between 10 and 50%. There's the dividend is exempt from tax, and where the holding is more than 50%, it is exempt. But then we must be mindful of the controlled foreign company legislation rules, which I will address later. Now, the reason for me indicating the conduit principle of a foreign trust is to identify or to draw to attention that the income that flows to a trust then flows through to the investor and it retains its nature. So moving on to the next slide, what we try to achieve in international tax planning is to change the nature of that return to a dividend. and structure the investment in such a way that the investor holds between 10% and 50% of the foreign company, able to receive a return or dividend from that foreign company, which is exempt from taxation in South Africa. So therefore, the process that we use is to utilize an offshore structure. And the example that we use in here would be to use the RAK IBC. RAK is one of the regions in the United Arab Emirates, and the tax rate there is 0%. So any return that the company makes on its investment is not subject to corporate tax, and any dividends that are declared to the investor are not subject to any withholding tax. So the structure or the investment portfolio becomes held by the UAE company in our example. And going back to the investment advisor, PSG, they would be appointed as the investment advisor to the company, making the investments and utilizing the expertise in driving those investments. And they'll also be appointed as the investment advisor to the trust as well. And the trust essentially will receive dividends from the RAK IBC. And because the dividends are structured in the manner, the return of those dividends will be exempt from tax in South Africa. So typically what we do is we create a trust, we create a structure which is first held by a trust. So we have a Mauritian trust which will hold the equity in the RAK IBC. And that equity is denominated in ordinary shares. The second stage of the investment is for the investor in South Africa to subscribe for shares in the RAK, and he will be issued a different class of shares, but the voting rights attached to those shares will give him at least 10% equity stake in that company, but not more than a 50% equity stake in that company. And that means that the RAK IBC, in our example, will not be considered to be a controlled foreign company. In the right-hand quadrant of the block there, I mentioned the CFC legislation. And one of the anti-avoidance provisions that exist in the South African Income Tax Act says, where a South African tax resident or South African tax residents jointly own more than 50% of the equity in a foreign company, the default position is the profits of the foreign company are attributed to the South African tax resident shareholders in their shareholding ratio. So if the South African investor held all the shares in the RAK IBC, then the investment returns made by that company would be subject to tax in South Africa by virtue of the provisions of Section 90. In the structure we proposing, the holding by the SA investor will be less than 50%, and therefore the attribution rules considered in the controlled foreign company legislation will not apply. So what effectively would happen in this scenario is that the investment returns from the collective investment schemes and the investment returns from direct shareholding would all be held or be earned by the RAK company. That company is then able to declare that to the South African investor as a dividend, and the directors are able to determine the quantum of the return to be declared to the investor, provided it does not exceed 50% of the profits made by the company. Otherwise, then it would fall back into the CFC legislation. And because the investor, South African tax resident investor, owns more than 10%, but less than 50% equity in the company, the dividend received from that company is exempt from tax in South Africa by virtue of the provisions of Section 10B2. And, that's the 10B2 exemption. 10B3 exemption I alluded to earlier, and that says where you hold the investment, where the investment percentage, or where the shareholding is less than 10%, then 20% of those dividends are taxed. But effectively, the structure that we achieve here is to ensure that the return of the dividends is exempt from tax. Then moving on to the next slide, what we need to ensure. Sorry, I just want to have a look at here. Sorry, I'm moving back to the quadrant on the bottom left-hand side. We talk about other tax considerations, and one of the piece of South African legislation talks about where a South African tax resident establishes a foreign trust that gives rise to a reportable arrangement. In the structure that we create, the South African investor first creates the RAK IBC as the initial shareholder. That IBC then establishes the trust and acquires their ordinary shares from the South African investor. And that means that the establishment of the trust is not subject to any reportable arrangements provisions in South Africa, for the reason that it is established by a non-South African tax resident. Obviously, there are anti-avoidance provisions in South Africa to try and prevent investors making use of such a structure. And the first thing is the attribution rules. And the first of that sits in section 7.8 and talks about where a South African tax resident makes a donation, settlement, or other disposition to a non-resident, i.e. a foreign trust, or including a foreign trust, any income earned in consequence of that donation, settlement, or other disposition is subject to tax in the hands of the South African fundor. This doesn't happen in the situation because the trust is not funded by way of a donation, settlement, or other disposition by a South African tax resident. That the original donation of $100 is created by the IBC, and the RAK IBC is initially funded the $100 by way of initial subscription for shares in the IBC. So section 7.8 wouldn't apply. Section 7C goes on to provide that where a South African tax resident makes a loan to a non-resident, and that loan isn't interest-bearing, a deemed rate of interest applies to that loan, and that interest becomes taxable in South Africa. By virtue of the structure that we utilize here, being the subscription for a different class of shares, and they are not preference shares. I emphasize they are not preference shares. The different class of shares, that means that it is not a lending instrument, but an equity instrument, and that means the provisions of section 7C doesn't apply. I mentioned the next aspect is the distribution of income and capital gains. What happens, I indicated, is that the trust will receive a investment returns from its portfolio. It will then declare a dividend to the investors, and that means it retains its nature as a dividend because the investor has, because the trust is receiving the income and it declaring a dividend to the investor, which owns 10%. The receipt of that dividend is exempt from tax. Any capital gains made by the company on its investments are again declared as a dividend to the individual, and therefore changes the nature from a capital gain, which will be taxable, to an exempt dividend. And then the third item there is the narrated distributions to South African tax resident beneficiaries. That's section 25B2A, and just is the piece of the legislation that determines the conduit principle for South African trusts or foreign trusts making distributions to the two South African tax residents, and indicating that the income or the nature of the income received by the trust is retains its nature when distributed to the beneficiaries. In this example, the trust will merely accumulate the benefits. It will hold a greater than 50% equity stake in the RAK company by virtue of the shareholding. So any distribution that it makes to the investor or the South African tax resident beneficiary would be subject to tax in South Africa, albeit at the rate of a maximum rate of 20%. But any amount not distributed by the trust remains outside South Africa and remains outside the estate of the South African investor. Then just moving on to the taxation of the trust in Mauritius. Because the trust would have been established by a non-resident, being the UAE company, established by a non-resident, and because there will be no Mauritian resident beneficiaries of the trust, that trust will be exempt from tax in Mauritius. So there will be no taxation in Mauritius on the income that is earned by that trust.